They tore down the bridge while Uncle Hank was still on it. I'm not kidding. I arrived just in time to see my 75-year-old uncle, dressed in plaid pajama pants and a Yale Law hoodie, calmly sipping his morning Earl Grey as a demolition crew revved up a bulldozer 10 feet away. The foreman looked confused. "Sir, you need to evacuate the structure." Hank didn't even blink. "Son, this bridge has stood through 2 wars and 3 hurricanes. I built part of it myself with stone from a Revolutionary War quarry. I'm not budging just because some suburban warlord with a clipboard and a superiority complex decided to throw a tantrum." That was when the bulldozer backed up and rammed through one of the side beams. I nearly leapt from my car. "Hank!" I yelled, sprinting toward the creek. But Uncle Hank just took one last sip, then stepped off the bridge like it was a Broadway exit. The whole thing collapsed behind him in a slow-motion pile of timber and heritage. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "They just declared war on the wrong federal judge." It had started with something ridiculous, as it often does. A few months earlier, a new HOA board had taken over the sleepy little community near my uncle's property. They called themselves the Neighborhood Harmony Council, which I found deeply ironic since the first thing they did was start handing out fines like Halloween candy. Suddenly, flower pots were unapproved installations, bird feeders were wildlife attractants, and kids' bikes were visual pollution. But they saved their biggest vendetta for my uncle's bridge. The bridge was a relic, hand-restored by Uncle Hank himself, and sat at the edge of his property where his land met a creek that had marked the boundary since colonial times. It wasn't even in the HOA's jurisdiction, but that didn't stop Karenna, the freshly crowned HOA president, from deciding it ruined the neighborhood aesthetic. Karenna was the kind of woman who printed out her own business cards for an unpaid position and once called animal control because a neighbor's cat looked at her aggressively. She'd tried to have the bridge condemned, citing bogus safety codes and one completely fabricated snake infestation report. Uncle Hank wasn't having it. He responded with a 3-page letter quoting federal heritage protections, municipal easement laws, and a beautifully worded paragraph explaining how the bridge had been formally listed in the State Registry of Historic Civil Engineering Site. Karenna responded with a sticker. No, really. She slapped a bright orange sticker on the bridge that said, "Scheduled for removal. HOA compliance required." Hank mailed it back to her with a note that said, "Return to sender." Unlawful nonsense. You'd think that would be the end of it. But Karenna didn't back down, she doubled down. She started sending increasingly threatening letters, each one less coherent than the last. One accused Hank of deliberate noncompliance with neighborhood beautification goals, whatever that meant. Another claimed the bridge posed a national security threat due to outdated construction. We laughed at that one for a full 10 minutes. Then came the fake demolition order. It looked official, complete with seals and a forged signature from a non-existent county inspector. Hank saw right through it, of course. He brought it inside, laid it gently on his desk, and muttered something about incompetence wearing lipstick. He called the county office to confirm it was a fake, which they did, but they also said there was no record of any HOA request for demolition approval. So we thought it was just another bluff. We didn't know Karenna had decided to take matters into her own hands. The morning of the demolition, I was driving up to spend the weekend when I saw the construction trucks rolling in from the highway. At first I thought it was roadwork, until I saw the loader's path heading straight for the creek. My stomach dropped. By the time I got there, the damage was already done. The bridge was in pieces, the contractors were packing up, and Karenna was standing at the edge with a latte in one hand and her phone in the other, live-streaming her victory over the eyesore. She actually turned to me and said, "You're welcome. Your uncle can use the main road now like a normal person." That's when Hank emerged from his house, holding a leather folder. He walked right up to her, handed her a printed copy of a federal injunction he'd had pre-written just in case, and said, "You may want to retain legal counsel." preferably someone familiar with felony vandalism and federal property laws. Karenna scoffed, waving the papers around like they were coupons. Oh please, this was just a community improvement effort. Hank tilted his head, calm as ever. Ma'am, you just unlawfully destroyed a structure that's not only historic, but also part of a federally funded restoration project. And you did so without a permit on private property, using falsified documents. You didn't just mess with a bridge. You messed with me. He turned to me and smiled, the way a chess master does after laying the trap 5 moves ago. Call your cousin in DC, tell her it's go time. My cousin, by the way, is an attorney at the Department of Justice. Hank had already put everything in motion. He knew Karenna would eventually go too far. He just didn't expect her to be this stupid, this fast. As I helped him sort through the wreckage of the bridge, I realized something chilling. The HOA didn't just overreach. They believed they were untouchable. Karenna and her clipboard brigade thought their little committee gave them the power to override law, logic, and property rights. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Hank wasn't just a retired judge. He was the kind of man who once made a billionaire cry during a courtroom cross-examination and then gave him directions to the nearest therapist. Later that night, Hank sat by the fire pit, sipping his second glass of scotch. You know, he said, some people build bridges. Others burn them. Karenna? She just blew hers up. And I'm going to make sure she drowns in the consequences. I believed him. Because when Uncle Hank says he's going to do something, the world shifts to make room. The HOA had no idea what was coming. But they were about to find out. The next morning, Uncle Hank was already at the kitchen table surrounded by documents, coffee brewing, printer whirring, and a stack of manila folders labeled like a law office in overdrive. You'd think he was preparing for a Supreme Court hearing, not responding to an overzealous HOA with a grudge against wooden infrastructure. I offered to make eggs, but he just waved a hand. No time. Justice first, cholesterol second. He wasn't angry in the way you'd expect. No shouting, no storming around. He was calm, calculated, which, frankly, was way scarier. I'd seen this exact expression on his face during a televised corruption trial, right before he reduced a state senator to tears and a fine worth 4 Teslas. He had already printed out satellite images, land records, and state preservation registry documents. We're building a case, he said, tapping the table. The goal isn't just a slap on the wrist. I want the wrist, the arm, and the HOA charter shredded for firewood. His precision was almost surgical. He already had the HOA's bylaws pulled up, annotated with legal references. He found a clause that clearly stated the HOA had no authority over private property bordering the creek. Then another clause that forbade the use of HOA funds for non-approved projects. And then the golden nugget, a clause about unauthorized destruction of third-party property, which, ironically, meant Karenna might have just violated her own precious rules in about 6 different ways. By noon, we were on our way to the county assessor's office. The clerk behind the desk perked up when she saw Uncle Hank. "Judge Halvorsen," she said, half whispering, half gasping, like she'd just seen a movie star. Hank gave her a courteous nod. "Just here for the fireworks paperwork." That earned a confused look until he slid a copy of the forged demolition order across the counter. Her eyes widened. Oh, this is not good. This isn't even our seal. It's from Parks and Recreation. And it's misspelled. Hank chuckled. Classic Karenna. Can't even counterfeit properly. We left with a notarized statement that no such permit had ever been requested or approved, along with 2 internal memos from the city's Historical Preservation Committee, both confirming that the bridge was under active protection status. Apparently, the paperwork for a federal restoration grant had just cleared the week before. Karenna had essentially bulldozed a national heritage site. Not a great look for someone whose biggest claim to fame was once getting HOA approval for blue hydrangeas on the neighborhood entryway. Back at the house, we weren't alone. A local contractor named Mitchell, One of the guys who had operated the equipment was waiting at the gate, nervous, guilty, wearing the universal uniform of a man about to confess, baseball cap, work boots, and hands fidgeting in pockets. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I swear I didn't. We just got a work order from the HOA. Said it was a nuisance removal. No permit. No questions." Uncle Hank motioned for him to sit. He offered the man lemonade like it was an old Southern courtroom drama. "Mitchell told us everything. Corinna had paid cash up front. Showed them the fake document. Told them Hank was senile and the bridge was a liability. I didn't believe it," Mitchell said, "but she threatened to get us blacklisted from future jobs in the neighborhood." Uncle Hank wrote everything down, then asked one question. "Do you mind repeating that on camera?" To my surprise, Mitchell agreed. He even agreed to hand over the work order, complete with Corinna's signature and her personal notes scribbled in the margins. My favorite part? A line that read, "Destroy it before the state can stop us." We knew what we had wasn't just good, it was explosive. But Uncle Hank wanted more. That evening, he invited his old friend Jody over for dinner. Jody wasn't just a lawyer. She was the current director of the State Historical Infrastructure Trust, and she had the authority to trigger a state-level investigation into destruction of heritage landmarks. Over barbecue ribs and cornbread, Jody looked over the evidence and whistled. "This is bad," she said. "Like, career-ending bad. Possibly criminal." Hank just nodded, pouring her a glass of bourbon. "Then we proceed with style." Meanwhile, Corinna was having the time of her life. We peeked at the HOA's private Facebook group, where she had posted triumphant photos of the bulldozed bridge, like she'd just led a military campaign. Her caption, "Eyesore eliminated. Progress." There were a few supportive comments from her usual yes-men, but the rest of the neighborhood? Not so thrilled. A post from old Mrs. Langston read, "I took my wedding photos on that bridge. You should be ashamed." Another comment simply said, "You didn't have the right. This isn't what the HOA is for." Corinna responded with a dismissive, "Y'all are overreacting. We made the neighborhood safer." Uncle Hank saw the post and chuckled. "You know what the worst kind of villain is?" he asked. "The kind who thinks they're the hero." He printed screenshots of all her social media posts, highlighting each one that could be used as evidence of premeditation. Then, in what might have been the most unexpectedly brilliant moment of the day, he drafted an open letter to the neighborhood and mailed hard copies to every single resident. The letter explained the legal violations, the historic status of the bridge, the forged documents, and Corinna's personal role in orchestrating the illegal demolition. It was clear, professional, and devastating. 2 days later, Corinna called an emergency HOA meeting. It was supposed to be a damage control session, but it turned into a roast. We didn't attend, of course, we just waited for the aftermath. One of the board members, visibly shaken, came by that night and rang the doorbell. He handed us a thumb drive. "I recorded the meeting," he said. "I think you'll want to hear it." He walked away without another word. We listened to it that night. Corinna tried to spin everything, claimed Hank was manipulating the law, that the bridge was never protected, that the state records were wrong. But then someone asked why she didn't wait for a real permit, why she paid cash, why she forged the order. Her answer? "Because I knew they'd say no. And I'm not letting a retired judge bully me." That was her fatal mistake, not just legally, but narratively. She turned this into a personal war. And Hank? He wasn't just going to win. He was going to make sure it was written into case law. As the fire crackled and the stars came out, Hank sat back in his chair and exhaled. "We've got the evidence, the witnesses, the timeline, and the motive. All we need now is a courtroom." He looked over at me. "And I think it's time I reminded a few people why I still have a federal judge's parking pass." Uncle Hank filed the lawsuit 3 days later, and it landed in the district court like a thunderclap. Civil suit for property destruction, fraudulent misrepresentation, abuse of authority, trespassing, and violation of federal historical protection statute. And just for good measure, he threw in a personal claim for emotional distress, which, knowing Hank, was less about money and more about poetic punctuation. The moment the papers were officially filed, the energy around the neighborhood shifted. It was like the HOA board had just discovered they weren't operating with diplomatic immunity. People started whispering in grocery stores, dogs barked louder when Karenna walked by, and the Facebook group went eerily quiet. Of course, Karenna didn't take it lying down. She marched into a town hall meeting in 6-inch heels and a blouse that looked like it had been stolen from a 90s courtroom drama. She made a speech about vindictive legal harassment and a smear campaign by a bitter old man clinging to outdated traditions. But no one cheered this time. No one even clapped. In fact, a few members of her own board avoided eye contact altogether. That same evening, she hired a lawyer, a local guy named Brock Lansing who wore sports sunglasses on his head indoors and called himself the Legal Hammer on his billboards. Hank glanced at his online profile, chuckled and said, "He's a personal injury guy. Perfect. She'll need that expertise when this backfires." Karenna's camp filed a response loaded with deflections. They claimed the bridge was on shared communal land, that Hank had failed to maintain it, and that the HOA acted in the best interest of neighborhood safety. There were no legal citations, no real defense, just a cocktail of arrogance, misinterpretation, and delusion. Hank barely blinked. "She just walked into a courtroom with a squirt gun and called it artillery," he said, marking up the documents with red pen like he was grading a freshman essay. The case started gaining traction. Local media picked up the story with headlines like HOA demolishes historic bridge, judge fights back, and neighborhood drama turns federal. A reporter even came to the house, hoping for an interview. Hank declined, but he did offer her coffee and a copy of the lawsuit. "Public record," he said. "You'll find the reading quite spirited." She nodded, then turned to me and whispered, "He's like Atticus Finch and Clint Eastwood rolled into one." Meanwhile, Karenna began losing her grip. She called an emergency HOA session and tried to pass a motion to use HOA funds for her legal defense. This did not go over well. One elderly board member, Mr. Langston, stood up and said, "I paid $400 in dues last year to maintain the tennis court, not to defend your bridge-blasting spree." Others began questioning the legitimacy of the vote that installed her as president in the first place. Rumors swirled that she had bullied her way into the position after the former president mysteriously resigned. And when someone asked about that, Karenna snapped and accused them of being secret operatives for the plaintiff. She was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Then came the cease and desist letter. Karenna, or more likely her dollar store litigator, sent a letter demanding Hank cease all defamatory and harassing behavior, including filing the lawsuit, sending letters to neighbors, and inciting public hysteria. Hank read it aloud over breakfast, pausing only to sip his tea. "This is adorable," he said. "I should frame it next to my federal appointment certificate." Then he wrote a rebuttal so thorough it made the original letter look like a scribble on a napkin. In it, he detailed every falsehood, misstep, and overreach with timestamps, evidence exhibits, and direct quotes from Karenna herself. He copied it to the court. And the press. The pressure started mounting in the most unexpected places. The neighborhood's garden club disinvited Karenna from its spring luncheon. The tennis league removed her from their email chain. Even the mailman started leaving her letters at the edge of her property, as if afraid of getting roped into a subpoena. She tried to save face by holding a public Q&A on the HOA lawn, but only 3 people showed up, and one of them was just walking their dog. Then came the big twist. A state historical preservation officer named Lena contacted Hank. She'd received word from Jody about the bridge's destruction and was livid. Turns out, the bridge wasn't just protected, it had been conditionally accepted into a multi-state historical tour program set to launch the following year. Corinna had obliterated what would have been a registered landmark on a national map. Lena promised to file an official report with the state's attorney general and offered to testify in court if needed. Hank accepted with a kind of smile that made you wonder if he kept a legal hit list in his sock drawer. And just when things couldn't get worse for Corinna, they did. One of her fellow board members, a quiet man named Phil who always looked vaguely stunned by everything, came forward with a flash drive. He'd been saving Corinna's emails and voice messages, unsure of what to do with them, until now. The contents were stunning. Emails where she admitted forging the demolition order. Recordings of her saying things like, "If I wait for permits, that old goat will stall it forever, and let him sue, no judge will take his side over a woman improving her community." Uncle Hank handed those over to his legal team. Yes, he had a legal team now. Half retired, half pro bono, all dangerous. Former clerks, old colleagues, a former prosecutor who owed him a favor after a mentorship in the 90s. They weren't just building a case, they were building a precedent. Corinna tried to push back one more time. She filed a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the HOA acted in reasonable scope of their civic duties. The judge reviewing the case, a soft-spoken man named Owens who had once shared a courtroom with Hank, denied it before lunch. His reasoning was scathing. No authority, no permit, no jurisdiction, and no common sense were demonstrated in the defendant's actions. Hank read that part out loud to me twice, smiling like a kid on Christmas morning. We sat on the porch that night, watching the wind roll across the field where the bridge used to stand. Hank lit a cigar, a rare indulgence. "We're past the legal stage," he said. "This is narrative now. Everyone sees her for what she is. Now it's just a matter of tying the bow." I asked him if he thought Corinna would settle. He shook his head. "People like her don't back down. They double down. That's why they lose harder." As the moonlight bathed the property, and the quiet hum of distant traffic filled the air, it was clear the battle lines were drawn. The HOA had made a mistake. A big one. But their biggest mistake wasn't destroying the bridge. It was underestimating the man who built it. The courtroom was packed. Every seat taken, even the folding chairs brought in at the last minute. Some folks weren't even from our town. They'd driven in from neighboring counties just to watch what the local paper had dubbed the trial of the HOA tyrant. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a spectacle. People whispered, phones were tucked under coats recording the moment, and someone was definitely taking bets in the back. Corinna walked in flanked by her lawyer, Brock Lansing, who looked like he'd just come from a CrossFit class and hadn't read a case brief since law school. He wore mirrored sunglasses on top of his head and carried a briefcase that seemed more for show than substance. Corinna herself wore a neon power suit with shoulder pads big enough to receive satellite signals. She smiled like she was walking into a game show, not a federal courtroom. Then Uncle Hank entered. The crowd went silent. He wasn't wearing a robe, obviously, but he might as well have been. His posture, his calm expression, his slow stride, he radiated authority. He had no attorney beside him because he didn't need one. He was representing himself, and as he reached the plaintiff's table, he turned slightly toward the gallery and gave a subtle nod to the crowd. It wasn't arrogance. It was promise. This wasn't going to be a hearing. This was going to be an education. The judge presiding was Meredith Owens, a longtime friend of Hank's from the Federal Circuit days. She was fair, sharp, and known for her dry wit. As she banged her gavel to begin, she gave Hank a knowing glance, then stared down Corinna and Brock with that special kind of judicial disappointment usually reserved for people who interrupt court with ringtones. Opening arguments were brief. Brock tried to frame the whole thing as a misunderstood civic action carried out with the best intentions for neighborhood safety and harmony. Hank didn't even object. He just sat there, letting Brock dig his own rhetorical grave. When it was Hank's turn, he stood, buttoned his blazer, and spoke in a voice that somehow felt like both thunder and velvet. "This is not a case of misunderstanding," he began. It is a case of arrogance, willful ignorance, and the reckless destruction of property that carries historical, cultural, and legal significance. This is not about a bridge. It is about power. About what happens when people confuse a clipboard for a crown. Then came the witness parade. First was Mitchell, the contractor who had unknowingly demolished the bridge. He took the stand, sweating through his work shirt, and confirmed every word he had confessed earlier. He told the court he'd been misled, shown fake permits, and paid under the table in cash. Brock tried to rattle him during cross-examination, suggesting Mitchell should have known better, but Mitchell fired back. "I build decks, sir. I don't run background checks on women with latte foam mustaches yelling about neighborhood improvement." The courtroom laughed. Even Judge Owens chuckled. Next came Lena from the State Historical Office. She explained, with painful precision, just how protected the bridge had been. She listed dates, documents, pending grants, and even showed a slideshow of the bridge's history, from original sketches drawn by a Civil War-era architect to photos of schoolchildren touring it last year. When Brock tried to question the authenticity of the documents, Lena replied, "Are you seriously arguing with the state seal right now?" Brock sat down without another word. But the real drama unfolded when Karenna took the stand. She seemed composed at first, answering questions in her usual passive-aggressive tone. "I merely sought to beautify our shared environment," she said. The structure in question was unsightly, overgrown, and obstructive. Hank let her ramble, waiting patiently, and then began his cross. "Mrs. Penwell," he said calmly, "are you aware that the bridge you demolished was listed in the National Historical Registry?" Karenna blinked. I had my doubts about that document's validity." "Did you contact any federal or state offices to confirm your doubts?" "No, but I believed." "Did you obtain a demolition permit?" "No." "Did you consult a structural engineer to assess its safety?" "No." "Did you, in fact, use your position on the HOA to hire contractors, pay them in cash, and instruct them to destroy a bridge that was not within HOA jurisdiction?" Her silence stretched across the room like a loaded slingshot. Hank smiled slightly. "Your Honor, I have no further questions." The final blow came with the audio files from Phil, the quiet board member. Judge Owens allowed them into evidence, and the courtroom listened as Karenna's own voice filled the air. "If I wait for permits, that old goat will stall it forever. Let him sue. No judge will side with him over me. And worst of all, we get rid of the bridge, we erase his legacy. Simple." The silence that followed was volcanic. Karenna's face went pale. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the defense table. The jury didn't even try to hide their expressions. It was over, and everyone knew it. Judge Owens recessed briefly and returned for the verdict. It was unanimous. The HOA was liable for destruction of protected federal property, trespassing, fraud, and misuse of organizational funds. Karenna was found personally responsible for fraudulent actions and ordered to pay restitution. The judgment totaled over $300,000 in damages, plus mandatory reconstruction of the bridge to its original specifications under state supervision. Karenna's name would be submitted to the state's regulatory board with a recommendation to bar her from holding any property management or organizational leadership role indefinitely. As the gavel came down, there was an eruption of clapping from the gallery. Owens banged it again to quiet them, but she didn't look angry. If anything, she looked satisfied. Karenna didn't wait for reporters outside. She ducked out a side door, followed by a camera crew and a neighbor's golden retriever who had apparently wandered into the chaos. Brock trailed behind her, muttering something about malpractice insurance. Meanwhile, Hank stood on the courthouse steps like the end of a western. He gave a short statement to the press, thanking the court, the Preservation Society, and his incredible legal team, which, to be clear, was mostly himself, his notes, and a laser printer. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just said, "Let this be a reminder that laws exist for a reason, and no amount of arrogance justifies rewriting them. That night, the neighborhood felt different. Quiet, yes, but peaceful. People were putting candles in their windows and leaving thank-you notes at Hank's mailbox. A few neighbors even offered to help rebuild the bridge, free of charge. We sat by the fire again, like we always did after long days. Hank looked at the stars, then said, "Sometimes the justice system feels like a bridge itself. Long, slow to cross, but built to carry weight. Karenna tried to blow it up. All she did was prove how much we still need it." The first beam of the rebuilt bridge went in on a crisp Saturday morning, less than 2 months after the court's ruling. But it didn't go in with just contractors and hard hats. It went in with neighbors, news crews, local school kids, and even a barbershop quartet someone had invited for ambience. Uncle Hank stood at the edge of the bank in his signature blazer and boots, overseeing the process like a general directing his troops. Only this battle wasn't about destruction, it was about restoration. It was poetic, almost absurdly so. The same people who once rolled their eyes at the old wooden bridge now carried timber across the field to help rebuild it. Someone brought coffee and donut. Someone else brought a banner that read, "The bridge that justice rebuilt." Hank chuckled when he saw it and muttered, "Bit on the nose, but I'll allow it." There was something surreal about watching the structure come back together. Every plank laid down seemed to repair not just wood, but trust. The neighborhood had shifted. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years were now shoulder to shoulder, swinging hammers and passing screws. A teenage kid who'd once spray-painted his name on a fence offered to stain the railings. Even old Mrs. Langston, who hadn't left her house for community events in 5 years, came by to plant wildflowers by the creek's edge. Hank never asked anyone for help. They showed up anyway. Meanwhile, Karenna had vanished. After the verdict, she went completely dark. No HOA meetings, no posts, not even passive-aggressive lawn signs. She tried to appeal the ruling, but the judge dismissed it so fast the paperwork hadn't even cooled from the printer. Rumor had it she'd put her house up for sale, though no one had seen a realtor's sign. Someone claimed she was hiding in a relative's cabin 2 towns over, but no one cared enough to verify it. She was done. Her reign ended not with a bang but with the soft rustling of HOA newsletters being rewritten. The final piece of the bridge went in on a warm Friday afternoon, and the grand reopening was scheduled for the next day. Hank insisted it be a community event. No big speeches, no press junket, just the people, the bridge, and maybe some ribs if he could get the smoker going in time. But the state had other ideas. Apparently word had traveled far and wide, and a state senator was now planning to attend, along with the head of the Historical Preservation Council. They wanted to formally designate the bridge as a cultural landmark and install a plaque in honor of its resilience against unauthorized destruction. Hank groaned when he heard it. "I'm not dead. Don't put me on a plaque yet." Still, he showed up sharp the next day, clean-shaven and wearing a tailored suit that hadn't seen daylight in a decade. The event was packed. Children played near the water's edge, musicians played acoustic folk songs, and someone set up a lemonade stand that turned into a surprisingly profitable side hustle. The senator gave a speech, but the crowd mostly tuned out until she got to the good part. The bridge was now not only protected at the state level, it was listed on a federal registry for culturally significant infrastructure. There would be educational tours, school field trips, and even a spot on an upcoming documentary about grassroots justice. Then came the surprise twist. Hank was handed a certificate, not just commemorating the bridge, but recognizing him personally for his contributions to the protection of public heritage and civic integrity. The senator called him a guardian of both history and law. For a moment, Hank looked genuinely moved. Not emotional, exactly. Hank didn't do tears, but there was a softness in his eyes. He raised the certificate and said simply, "I didn't do it alone." Then he pointed at the crowd and added, "We did this. We all said no to overreach, and yes to doing things the right way." The plaque was unveiled shortly after. It read, This bridge stands as a symbol of justice, perseverance, and community. Rebuilt not only in timber, but in trust. Destroyed by arrogance, restored by unity. Below that, a smaller inscription, dedicated to Judge Henry Halvorson and all who stood by the law. Hank grimaced and muttered, "Could have just said bridge, back again." But I saw him glance at it more than once that day. The days that followed were quiet but bright. The creek sparkled again. Children ran across the bridge like it was a playground. The town even started planning an annual festival to celebrate the community's resilience. Bridge Day, they called it. It involved food trucks, local vendors, and, somehow, a pie-eating contest that got wildly out of hand by year 2. Hank never officially endorsed the festival, but he never missed one either. As for Karenna, her story ended with far less celebration. Her house sat on the market for months before finally selling at a steep discount. The new owners tore down her garden gnome army and donated the patio furniture she'd hoarded like it was gold. Last we heard, she was trying to start fresh in a new neighborhood, but her name followed her like a shadow. Apparently, when the new HOA Googled her, the trial transcripts popped up first. She didn't get elected to anything. Hank received invitations to speak at 2 law schools and a preservation conference, both of which he turned down with polite note. "Too much talking," he said. "Let the bridge do the speaking now." But he did agree to give a short interview for a local podcast called Civic Courage, where he shared his perspective. He kept it short and sharp. Know your rights, stand your ground, and never let someone with a name tag and a god complex dictate what you can do on your own land. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and cast long golden shadows across the creek, I walked the bridge with Hank. It creaked just a little under our steps, comforting, solid, familiar. He stopped at the middle, leaned on the railing, and looked out over the water. "Funny thing about bridges," he said. "They're not just connections between land. They're tests. Tests of strength, of patience, of time. Some fall. But the ones that matter? They rise again." He reached into his pocket and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a deed transfer. My name, in black ink, officially listed as the co-owner of the land the bridge stood on. "You're next," he said. "I fought my battle. You'll know when yours comes." I wanted to say something profound, something to mark the moment. But all I managed was, "I won't let clipboard tyrants near it, I promise." He laughed, full and deep, the kind of laugh that comes when the storm has passed and the sky is clear. We stood there a while longer, watching the water flow beneath us, the bridge casting its shadow across both banks. It stood strong, unmoved, exactly where it belonged. And this time, it was never going anywhere.